Yes. Thank you so much, Charles. Thanks a lot to organizers and to participants of our event. It's an honor for me to speak here. Could we please switch to the next slide? Yeah. The first thing I'd like to say is that Russia now is amidst a transitional period when all former institutions are weakened or do not even work, and new institutions have been either established recently or are planned only to be established. This makes the situation very vulnerable. It's easier to transform the system, but it's less resilient. The system is less resilient than ever. It's possible to say that Putin is caught in his jump when he did try a year ago to start a political transformation aimed for him to keep control over the system after 2024. And due to, well, different kinds of black swans, it appeared that he is not capable to continue in a way it has been planned initially. Anyway, we can say that all institutions are weakened now, and there is only one, the great president. It's Putin himself, his administration, and all different kinds of councils connected to the president directly. So they are pretty strong, and the system is even more personalized now than it used to be, with the Kremlin controlling almost all institutions and all branches of power. The constitution is revised, and there should be a lot of additional laws to be implemented to finish the constitutional reform. And the continuation of the whole transformation is under the question now. And that's why we see that Putin is postponing his presidential address, because he should present the new vision of how the system should behave and should look in April, perhaps. The next slide, please. So the constitutional reform is on the way. Generally speaking, it doesn't look a kind of a game changer, except for only one amendment connected with nullifying presidential terms, and it could be done in much easier way. So in general, we can say that the constitution describes, most of all, describes those changes which have already taken place. And it doesn't influence essentially what's going on. And the good illustration can be seen in the case when last November 5 cabinet ministers have been replaced. And it was going on just like before these amendments, although the constitution now defines very different way how the State Duma should participate in replacing ministers of the cabinet. There are tough political repressions going on, and the recent one you've heard is the case when one of 85 Russian governors, Belozertsev from Penza region, has been arrested along with medium-sized oligarch in pharma, Boris Spiegel. And it demonstrates both repressions against elites at the federal level and repressions against elites at the regional level. So if, there will be any interest, we can discuss this in more details. And there are already new repressive laws have been adopted, which can be seen as much tougher pressure onto political class and onto civil society. Local self-administration did almost disappear, and a good illustration of this fact is the case of mayors of regional centers. In Russia, only regional capitals matter out of municipalities. And there used to be only 8 mayors who are directly elected until recently. And recently, one of them has been arrested, Mayor of Tomsk, city in Siberia. One of them, Mayor of Yakutsk, has been pushed out. So only 6 mayors remained out of 85 who are directly elected by citizens. And my last point is about Siloviki. It's very important to understand, I think, that Siloviki are now very strong as a corporation, as a mega corporation, but at the same time, they are weakened at a personal level. So none of bosses of major Siloviki agencies can be seen now as being the same or even stronger than it used to be a couple of years ago. The next slide, please. If to speak about weakened institutions, it's needed to start with judiciary, which is now much weaker than it used to be before the constitutional reform, due to the fact that the president got the right now to dismiss any high court judge of the constitutional court, judge of the Supreme Court. In case of legislation, legislative elections to the State Duma, first of all, and to 38 regional legislative assemblies should take place later this year in September. And that's why the Duma did play a very passive role in the constitutional reform, because all of deputies now are very dependent from the Kremlin, whether they will be allowed to participate in next Duma elections. And the president got additional right to appoint 30 senators to the upper house, to the Federation Council, including 7 senators for life. Executive branch, although the government looks now much stronger and much more like a team than under the previous Prime Minister Dmitry Medvedev, it's almost directly subordinated now to the president via the State Council, and the Prime Minister can be much easier replaced now than it used to be. Local self-administration is considered to be now the bottom level of the system of public power, so it lost its position of separate branch of power as it used to be under the previous constitution. And there is radical reshuffling of the prosecution, which is very important element of the puzzle. It was at the very beginning of the reform of the political transformation, when prosecutor general has been replaced, and prosecution is a kind of a bridge between elites, both political and business elites from one side, and the state apparatus. So all agreements between different elite groups, between different clans, are under the question now, due to the fact that prosecution now not only is very new body under the new prosecutor general Igor Krasnov, but almost all agreements now are no more active, and new ones should be concluded. The next slide, please. Here is the new Prime Minister Mikhail Mishustin, who came last year almost out of blue. But I'd like to emphasize 2 interesting things. He is not a man from the margin. He came from the core of Russian elites, and there are 2 reasons why I am saying this. First, he's a member of so-called Serafim Sarovsky group, Sarovsky Brotherhood. It's religious group, and it consists of many important persons from Russian elites. I would name Sergei Kiriyenko, the first deputy chief of staff. I would name Chernyshenko, the vice prime minister deputy of Mishustin, Andrei Belousov, who is considered to be a kind of counterbalance to Mishustin being the first deputy prime minister, but he came from the same Sarovsky group. Another very important group in Russian elites is composed by those who are playing hockey with President Putin, and Mishustin is one of them. And here he plays together with Timchenko, one of the very powerful Russian oligarchs, together with Putin himself, together with Alexei Kudrin, who is very close to Putin, and many other important persons. And there are two things where Mishustin is considered to be strongest of all. It's digitalization, and it's the official reason why he was invited to head the government after making very important reforms at the Federal Taxation Agency. And his another strong feature is connection to regions. And he's very active in doing his trips to regions, and he pays very much attention to regions. The next slide, please. The government is undertaking now very serious transformation, and we are on the very eve of the end of many different transformations taking place at the government. April 1st is considered to be the date when several important moves should be finished. And I would name only major of them. It's ministries and reshaping of ministries, replacement of many ministers, and especially replacements at the level of deputy ministers and of the central apparatus. In Russia, governmental apparatus plays very important role. It's as big as presidential staff, and Mishustin did not only expand this apparatus recently in January, February, but he did replace almost all deputy chiefs of staff, of governmental staff, and chiefs of departments. They are making this apparatus very consolidated body controlled by him directly, and his two hands, Dmitry Grigorenko, who used to be his deputy for many years at the taxation service and who is his deputy now. And at the bottom, you can see that he is in charge of some very important major ministries and bodies of power. And Dmitry Chernyshenko, who is Mishustin's schoolmate from the university, and he is in charge of the coordination center of digitalization in general and many other important things. At one point, it looks like the government does no more have the system of internal checks and balances, which used to exist earlier. And Mishustin is very skillful apparatchik. So he did manage to put into the corner Andrei Belousov, who was considered to be a kind of counterbalance to Mishustin, responsible for working out strategy of the government. And Anton Siluanov, the former first deputy of the prime minister and the minister of finances. So these two guys have been appointed by Putin, not chosen by Mishustin, and they do look much weaker now than they looked before. So there is the list of several other important changes which took place at the government. Let me add one more thing. It's establishment of regions management centers. It has been done by the end of last year. These centers will play very important role in many different ways. At first, they should play important role in two major political campaigns in Duma elections this year and in presidential elections in 2024. It's a kind of extra regional bodies of power directly controlled by the center, who should control social networks and who should define major problems in this or that region and give orders to regional authorities to fix these problems. At the same time, they should inform the federal center about what's going on in this or that region. They are considered to be major bodies responsible for regional digitalization. So now there is special position of the major officer for digitalization in a region. These guys are appointed and are paid by the federal center, and it did cause certain resistance in some regions because, well, regional governors do have understandable suspicion about what exactly these regional management centers should do in their regions. So I would say that, in my view, what's going on at the government right now, and it did start intensively last November, and it should finish in a week from now. I would say that, in my view, there are three major results. One should be creation of more or less positive social background, which was Putin's aim a year ago. And that's why, before announcing the large-scale constitutional and broader political reform, he did focus on how much money the government will distribute in order to create the vision that, in spite of economic stagnation, the life level is increasing. It never happened due to the pandemic. And now the government is eager to start anew. And this is exactly what the government controlled by Mishustin should do. At the same time, it should improve image of the President Putin, which looks not that good, and his approval rating is still pretty high. But level of trust to him did increase, I would say, essentially in last several months. And that's why it's needed to present some positive results in order to charm Russians. And why it's important now, it's very important in order to continue political transformation which is going on. And that's why the positive social background is deadly needed. And the third, and perhaps very important and threatening result, should be establishment of a kind of mobilization management system, which is focused on making fast decisions and fixing problems in economy. It's the aim of the so-called coordinative center, and it will make Russia and Russian economy much more resilient in case of continuation and strengthening of confrontation with the West. Next slide, please. Siloviki, it's very important point. I would not bother you with all these details, but I will only say that first, as I did already mention, Siloviki personally are much weaker now than they used to be. Half of them are waiting to be replaced, like, say, the head of the FSB, Federal Security Service, like perhaps Secretary of the Security Council, Nikolai Petrov, like Minister of Interior, Vladimir Kolokoltsev, and like the head of Investigative Committee. Not only they are old enough, but they are weakened. And recently there were several replacements, and some of trusted members at the top of these agencies have been replaced by newly appointed guys who are not directly controlled by bosses in these agencies. And last year, for example, all of 3 heads of major investigative departments in FSB from one side, in the Ministry of Interior, and at the investigative committee have been replaced. I would attract your attention to the fact that FSB is not FSB itself, which is the strongest mega corporation, is not very consolidated agency, which is definitely not controlled by its boss, Alexander Bortnikov, and there is a very complicated system of checks and balances within the agency, and very intensive competition, sometimes even fight between different clans and groups. And that's the way how the Kremlin is capable to keep control over Siloviki. Prosecution is another very important agency where the prosecutor general has been replaced the next day after announcement of the political transformation, and where large-scale replacements at both the top federal level and at regional level are going on. The next slide, please. Here we're coming to the models of Putin's elites, and here is the list of models offered last, say, 10 years. The reason why I do mention all of them is that first, their sequence does tell a lot about how elites look and how their structure evolves. But at the same time, we can find elements of each of these models at present. So the newest one, the Tsar's Court, is the model developed last year or 2 years ago. And it tells that there are 2 very important persons in political class in Russia, one represented by grandees like Igor Sechin, for example, who do have their certain autonomy and who can play by themselves. And second are those guys who are very close to Putin, like courtiers, and whose major resource is proximity to Putin. Let me say a few words about each of these models, starting from the first, the Kremlin towers. There is very well-known expression that there are many towers at the Kremlin, and the essence of this wisdom is that there are different groups inside the government which do have different, sometimes competing interests, and there is very complicated combination of their interests which can lead to certain decisions to be made. The problem is how to look at these groups. At the initial concept of the Kremlin towers, the reason why certain persons were considered to establish solid groups, solid and stable groups, was their business connection in 90s, especially in St. Petersburg, where a good portion of Russian elites is from. And the idea was that, well, when working together in business in early 90s, they do still keep their connections and closedness now. It's not the case, and the next model of the solar system looks at Russian elites as being composed at the planet system by planets rotating around our sun, around Vladimir Putin. What is important is proximity to Putin, your orbit, and they can form constellations at certain moment, but the next moment they can move in very different directions, meaning that there are alliances, but these alliances are not very stable, are temporary, and that's why there are no more stable towers at the Kremlin. What is important in this model is that it looks at the most important, in political sense, persons in Russia as forming three different orbits. The closest to Putin is the orbit of his senior partners. Those guys can give him advice, and either political or business advice, like Igor Sechin, for example. The next orbit is composed by junior partners who are absolutely trusted, but who cannot speak to Putin on their own. And they can be asked by Putin, and in this case, they can give him certain advice. And then there is the level of loyal servants, of those who are trusted, but who will not be taken into account in case major decisions are made. And it's very important to understand that these dangerous Siloviki are most of all at this third orbit of loyal servants. So they are playing instrumental role rather than participating in making major decisions. Then the model of Politburo comes, which is looking at certain similarities between political class in the Soviet Union and in Putin's Russia. And what is good about this model is the fact that not only this is very general concept, but this is very detailed description made by Evgeny Minchenko, which description which is amended all the time. And if you are interested to understand who is connected to this or that Politburo member, you should look at this model and at its most recent revision made by Evgeny Minchenko. So according to this model, there are several most important persons around Putin, like Moscow Mayor Sergei Sobyanin, like Sechin, whom I did already mention, like Sergei Shoigu, the Minister of Defense. What is important about this Politburo? It's the fact that it consists of Putin's oligarchs, most of all, rather than of officials. And it brings me to another model, which looks at Russia as a big corporation and differs between managers and shareholders. To a certain extent, there are some similarities between these two most recent models, in the sense that managers, like say ministers, even prime minister, do play a very important role in realizing decisions, but do not necessarily play an important role in making major decisions, where shareholders like Yuri Kovalchuk, for example, who is almost non-visible at the surface because he doesn't occupy any official positions, can play much more important role than any of managers appointed by him and directly connected to him. Now, the system of, the very design of Putin's elites is changing. It can be called now the leader in the bunker. And the fact that Putin stays in the bunker not only means that he is separated from his usual sources of information rather than secret services, but it means also that it's very complicated for him to communicate. As you know, it takes 2 weeks in current time if you do want, and if he does want you to meet him in person, which makes it almost impossible for those who are involved in daily management to meet with Putin in person. Let's go to the next slide, please. Now, I should say a few words about foreign policy implications. First of all, foreign policy is, you cannot separate between foreign policy and domestic politics. That's why I would not take seriously the view of some experts that Putin is now focused on geopolitical games and does not participate in making domestic political decisions. I think it's not the case. The second point is that Russian foreign policy, even being considered due to the reasons to be very aggressive, is defensive rather than offensive. So the Kremlin is trying to find counterplay rather than to attack. The third is about fights without rules, which is favorite Kremlin's game. And that's why the Kremlin is not very much interested in dealing with alliances like European Union, for example, and it prefers bilateral communications being sure, and there are understandable grounds for this, that it's much easier to reach a compromise when dealing with big countries. And it's a way how the Kremlin views Russia as a great power, and it's eager to deal with great powers, but not with tiny, small countries like, say, Baltic states in Kremlin's view. I would mention only a couple more things. It's about the coronavirus and how it's going on, well, in Russia. And I think it tells a lot about Russia in many different ways. First of all, I would say that 3 vaccines which have been made in Russia look pretty good. And that's how it worked almost all the time in Russian history. Russia was very good in making something, some unique things, but it's not that good in organizing mass production of these things. So vaccination is not very effective in Russia in terms of share of Russians who got vaccines. You know, perhaps that Putin got vaccine yesterday, but the share of Russians who got vaccines is negligible, and 1/3 of all vaccines produced in Russia are sent abroad. And that shows another very typical Russian thing when choosing between security of your fellow countrymen, health security, and foreign policy, and the possibility to use vaccination and to use coronavirus in order to promote your foreign political goals. The latter are preferred. And I would say that, in my view, this is a very good example of how it works in Russia and how decisions are made and what is the cost of life, if especially from one side there is life of ordinary Russian, from other side it's something else. And what is important that Russians themselves do not trust their government in case of vaccines as well. So Russia, as well as some other post-Soviet and Eastern European countries, average citizens in Russia do not believe that vaccination is a good thing and that Russian vaccine is good enough. From one side, it's due to huge propagandist campaign aimed to demonstrate that foreign vaccines are bad. But from other side, it's result of not very massive production of vaccines in Russia when the government is not very much interested to promote vaccines. Let's go to the next slide, please. This is the last one on future of Russia. And what is important, I think, to understand is the fact that Russia now is amidst its political transformation, the most large-scale transformation in 30 years. And it looks like perestroika Mark II, not due to the fact that Vladimir Putin was eager to start perestroika. He hates perestroika, Gorbachev's perestroika, I mean. But he did start to change the system, and it brought to life many consequences which have not been planned in advance. And now, I think he's rethinking how exactly to finish this transformation in order to let him to be in power, but at the same time not to exercise daily duties. And there are three major priorities in the transformation logic. First is reproduction of the system, securing Putin's power, and dealing with these external challenges. And the balance is changing all the time. At first, the major idea was to reproduce the system and to secure Putin's power. Then several very serious challenges came, and the system is trying now to respond in effective way. What is important to understand that there is already large-scale reshuffle of personnel, including in the law enforcement, and the one which will follow, and I would say this year, is even more serious. So we should wait for large-scale replacements at very different bodies of power, including law enforcement, including political parties, and including highest courts, and many other things. In my view, the aim of Putin is to construct a kind of perfect managerial machine and to put it on autopilot when he can stay aside and he can intervene anytime if needed, but not to bear daily duties of the state management. And this is exactly what is going on if to look at different structures, different bodies of power which have been created. So I would say that it looks more like multi-headed Hydra scheme rather than two-headed eagle. Until now, we did have two different governments, one led by the prime minister, another one led by Putin, which consisted of law enforcement and Ministry of Foreign Affairs and some other important agencies. But now we do have Внешэкономбанк, which is considered to become the mega development institute. We do have the Cossacks Commission on International Development, on Foreign Development, which will take out of the government several important powers. And we do have the new State Council, which has been announced, which has been established in a new shape, but which did not demonstrate how exactly it should work. The next slide, please. I was speaking all the time about political elites, but this is important to look at how exactly average or ordinary Russians do see what's going on. And there are two charts at the end of my presentation, one showing the attitude toward Russia at the West. It's here. And the most popular answers is that there is anxiety, there is fear, and there is contempt and disdain at the West with regard to Russia. Now let's look to another slide showing the attitude in Russia to the West. It shows certain respect and certain anxiety, and here the balance look very differently from how it looks from the other side. We're saying this, the last image, please. I'd like to attract your attention to the fact that not only what's going on outside Russia is influencing what's going on inside Russia, but Kremlin reaction to what's going on and its moves, including in connection to internet and social media, can play very negative role for the political transformation which has been started by Putin. Thank you, and that's the end of my presentation. I'll be eager to answer questions if any.
Thank you very much indeed. Okay, we'll now turn over to Richard. Nikolai, if you can mute, and Richard, if you can start.
Thanks, Charles. And next slide, please. I have about 10 to 15 minutes, so I'll keep my remarks on the economy relatively brief. I'll cover three things. I'm going to talk about Russia's performance last year, economic performance, and compared to other countries, talk about some of the major policy concerns that will be concerning, as concerns do, the Russian policy elite, and then talk about prospects for 2021 and beyond, and the major things, problems, challenges facing the Russian economy. Next slide, please. So this on this first slide, as you can see here, you can see Russia's performance last year with a contraction of around about, according to the most recent estimate, 3.1% of GDP. So in relative terms, Russia did quite well. As you can see, it was the best performing major economy in Europe, and it did better than all other top 10 economies across the world, other than China. As you can see, the only country to have continued to grow. So what's interesting is, why did Russia do so well? There are three relatively straightforward answers to that. Number one, Russia's move to a flexible exchange rate in 2015, alongside low levels of debt, meant that Russia performed much better than during previous financial and oil price shock induced crises, such as in 2008 and 2015. There wasn't a great exodus of capital leaving Russia when oil prices collapsed back in March a year ago, and the general flight to safety that we saw across the world towards the dollar didn't affect Russia as much as it had done in previous international crises. And the flexible exchange rate and the low levels of debt, and this has been a core component of Russia's security-first economic policy over the last 5 or so years, really did come to their rescue. Another way in which the flexible exchange rate helped was that although oil prices declined very sharply in the second quarter of the year, ruble income didn't decline as fast, and that was because of the flexible exchange rate. The exchange rate depreciated faster than the oil price fell, and this meant that the decline in ruble income was relatively moderate. This leads me to my second point. This enabled the government to provide quite targeted, but also sufficiently strong fiscal support at the height of the crisis. If we think about Q2 and Q3 last year. Now, this wasn't always evenly and fairly distributed across the population. Instead, it was focused at key pillars of regime support, so particular parts of manufacturing and industry, with resources flowing to parts of the economy where key political supporters are located. But nevertheless, if we do look at the expansion of federal government expenditure in 2020 in response to the crisis, we can see that last year, federal government expenditure as a proportion of GDP at 21.4%, I think, was the second highest it had been since 2000. Only in response to the 2008 crisis did the Russian government spend more money as a proportion of GDP. So this was as we've seen elsewhere across the world, a pretty active response by the government. But unlike other countries elsewhere across the world, Russia did this without running a large deficit. So Russia's deficit last year is estimated to be around about 4% of GDP. And that compares with between anywhere a range of 10 to 20% of GDP in other major economies like the UK, US, China, Japan, etc. So Russia could perform relatively well, and it did so at a relatively low cost compared to other economies. And all of this with relatively low oil prices. Although we shouldn't overstate the extent to which prices were low last year, for at least as far as Russia's finances were concerned. Although the price did dip very sharply in March, April, May, if we look at the average 2020 Urals oil price, it was close to what the budget had assumed it would be at the end of 2019. It was a very conservative budget, and it had assumed an average oil price of around about $41 a barrel, and it wasn't far off that in the end. And the third thing that helped Russia perform relatively well last year was that the restrictions in response to coronavirus were relatively short and sharp, concentrated really in May of last year. And after that, they were largely relaxed across the country. Russia has gone about its business, everyday life, in a much more relaxed fashion than certainly any other country or most other countries in Europe and elsewhere across the world. Now, this wasn't great from a health point of view. Russia's excess deaths rose very sharply from autumn onwards. From September and October, this really did start to reach extremely high levels. But from a purely economic point of view, this helped moderate the extent of the recession. Next slide, please. If we look at the policy concerns that are facing the government at the moment, there are many. Some of them have been covered in excellent detail there by Nikolai. But if we just focus on the economic dimension and look at the main standout points, we can see that the Mishustin government was busy not only coping with the pandemic last year, but also with devising new measures that were designed to enhance Russian economic performance over the longer term. And these were sometimes presented as anti-crisis measures or measures to stimulate recovery from the crisis, but in reality, they were more to do with raising the longer-term potential growth rate. And this preoccupation with long-term growth is understandable. Since 2012, economic activity has been sluggish. And as you can see on the chart here, a much cited official figure for real personal income has been mostly negative since 2012, implying that the average material welfare of a Russian citizen was about 10% less than in 2013. Now, 2013 is an important point because that was arguably the point in time when the average Russian citizen was as well off as he or she ever has been in the last 300 years. So we're talking about from a very, relatively speaking, high level. But this real personal income figure is important and provides an important background to the policy discussions. Now, there are two main areas of policy debate. One's the national projects, and the other is improving incentives to raise the rate of investment. And the two characteristics, though, that underlie this discussion, that frame it, are one, an adherence to fiscal austerity. The federal budget is projected to be back in surplus next year. And second, to maintain a leading role for the state. Again, this is very consistent with what Nikolai has just been talking about. If we look at the national projects, they were set out in 2018 as part of Mr. Putin's election campaign. They were originally planned to end in 2024, but got off to such a slow start and were then hit by the pandemic that they have now been reset to run up to 2030. And the whole machinery of bureaucratic management, including key performance indicators for regional governments, all the things that Nikolai has just been talking about have been set up around this to help Russia achieve these national targets. And that has been and remains, despite the pandemic, the central component of economic policy. So far, it hasn't really had much impact, but then we wouldn't expect anything to do that during a pandemic year, although the evidence wasn't good that it was having much impact before that. If we look at the incentives to increase or improve the investment climate, and this is, again, a long-term issue. Fixed investment has been in the doldrums in Russia for, well, we could say for several years, or we could say for several decades. The share of investment in the Russian economy is around about 20% and has been for most of the post-Soviet period. Now, for a country of Russia's income level, it should be investing around about 25 to 30% of GDP annually if Russia is to experience sort of large-scale modernization and upgrading of its infrastructure, of its physical capital, factories, and such like. And so far, it hasn't invested enough. Now, in 2020, investment fell by at least 1.5%, according to early estimates that exclude small business. And so far, though, any effort to try to raise this has been hampered by two things. On the one hand, the state is adhering to this strict conservative fiscal policy, which means that it refuses to provide a state-led investment strategy. On the other hand, the business environment is so poor that private sector entities aren't picking up the slack and investing themselves. This problem hasn't been resolved. All of the things that Nikolai has spoken about have done nothing so far to suggest that we'll see any meaningful increase in the rate of investment in the near future. Next slide, please. And then if we look to the future, the recovery, as we can see on this chart, is expected as it is across the world and has rather shakily begun. There are the usual caveats for Russia, as there are for other countries dealing with the pandemic. The recovery should continue, provided that there are no new or especially troublesome variants of the virus. And it's predicated on a steady rollout of the vaccination program, which, as Nikolai has pointed out, has not been that steady in Russia to date. The Sputnik vaccine appears on limited evidence so far to be safe and effective, but again, as Nikolai pointed out, there's a low level of trust amongst the population in taking it up. All of that to one side, the IMF forecasts 3% growth of Russian GDP in 2021. And as you can see, that compares relatively unfavorably with a sample of countries in the chart. So a comparatively modest recovery after a comparatively modest decline. And all of these figures, of course, are subject to considerable uncertainty. I mean, Russia's case, the medium-term trend rate of growth is 1.5% to 2% per year. And this implies that it should slow down after 2021 anyway. And if it does, that will be below the rates of growth that the government has projected or targeted to emerge as a result of the National Projects Programme. But so far, neither consumption nor investment have shown any signs of strong growth or particularly strong recovery, and government spending continues to be constrained by policymakers' preoccupation with economic security and stability. Next slide, please. If we're looking to the future and looking at the key problems facing Russia, I've identified two, which I shall briefly describe. We can always follow them up in Q&A. Number one, faster growth requires faster investment. I've touched on the fact that the government's not doing the investment here, despite the fact that the state has control of all major parts of the economy, yet it still refuses to invest because of this commitment to fiscal austerity. Now, the share of foreign capital has declined, and Russia has been under, certainly certain sectors of it, forms of sectoral sanctions that have dampened capital flows into Russia since 2014. Now, this is partially explained by sanctions, this decline in the share of foreign capital, but it's also due to an official desire to dampen capital flows more widely, to reduce volatility, but also because of this poor investment climate that I mentioned. Nikolai mentioned the political changes that are taking place at the top in Russia at the moment, and hinted when he was talking about the regional governors at the charges that are being laid of corruption against various different individuals. I would expect this to continue, for there to be more accusations of corporate raiding, register, as property is redistributed, as the elite strengthens its grip over certain parts of the elite and pushes other parts out, or signals to other parts that behavior needs to change. So this redistribution of property, which is a sort of an endemic aspect of Russia's system of political economy, is likely to continue, and it's not very good for investment. It reduces the incentive for Russian entrepreneurs and business people to invest when they think that their property may be taken off them at a later point for political reasons. So given the importance of these other factors, weak property rights, for instance, we should be wary of explaining low investment by sanctions, or in assuming that lifting or relaxing sanctions, which doesn't look likely, would, if it happened, lead to higher investment. Low investment in Russia is a constant, and over the course of 20 years, sanctions have been a variable. Second big problem, I think, or challenge facing Russia is that of potential energy transition. I say potential because we don't know what the global energy consumption profile will look like over the next few years. But a lot of people, myself included, have been writing about what would it mean for Russia if this happened. If there was a significant shift away from hydrocarbons and towards renewables, this should, all things equal, mean the price of hydrocarbons declining. If that happens, what does it mean for states that rely on the redistribution of hydrocarbon revenues for their system of political economy to function? This, I think, is perhaps the biggest problem for Russia, or certainly the biggest challenge. Now, what's interesting is that so far, the Russian government appears to be betting on this not happening. And you could call this the ostrich approach, or you could see it as a shrewd bet. If we look at recently published energy strategies, if we look at official statements by officials active in the energy industry, and if we look at investment decisions, such as the decision to develop the enormous Vostok field in northern Siberia, we can see that the Russian government is so far behaving as though hydrocarbons will continue to play a very big part in the global energy consumption profile for years to come. And so they're putting a lot of money on that bet. If it pays off, then Russia could find itself halfway through the next decade in a very pretty position where it has invested in something, going against the market. And it may benefit from higher prices and having invested in it. However, if the bet goes sour, if the world does move away from hydrocarbons and prices enter a secular decline, then the entire edifice of the Russian system of political economy will be compromised, I suggest. We can talk about this perhaps in the small amount of time that is left. That's the end of my presentation, but I was asked to address a question that was put by the audience before the event to do with foreign economic strategy. And the question was, how does Russia's policy of proactive vaccine distribution abroad fit into its overall trade strategy? And would this give Russia an advantage in trade negotiations, including on Russian involvement in energy projects abroad? And the short answer to that is that I think that the Sputnik vaccine does play an important role in the overall trade strategy. That overall trade strategy is diversification beyond the West to the non-West, put very simply. And the non-West really mainly meaning Asia, Southeast Asia and South Asia, but also the Middle East, North Africa and Latin America. And if we look at where Russia has agreed to sell vaccine and where it has agreed to outsource manufacturing, China, India, Argentina, places like this, we can see that its efforts have reflected this wider, longer-term diversification to non-Western countries. However, whether this yields any new results remains to be seen. It depends on how well Russia performs. As Nikolai pointed out, Russia has historically been very good at inventing things, but not necessarily as good at moving into serial high-quality production of said inventions. I would also add that the countries where Russia has so far successfully marketed the vaccine also happen to be the same countries where Russia already has good relations. If we look in Europe, it's the likes of Hungary and Serbia, countries that Russia already has good relations with and that are signed up to take the vaccine. And if we look elsewhere, India, China, and countries in Africa and the Middle East, these are all countries where Russia is already active and has signed energy deals and arms export deals and deals to build nuclear power plants. So in my opinion, so far, Sputnik 5 has cemented existing relationships rather than allowed Russia to build new relationships from scratch. Moreover, if it doesn't deliver, it could end up undermining those relations. I will leave it at that. I hope I haven't gone on for too long. Over to you, Charles.